Alrighty, so in today's video, we're going to be looking at tenor and answering the what questions. What is tenor? What are the three aspects of tenor? What are some examples of these aspects of tenor? And is there a difference between tenor and tone? Hello, I'm Evan from EnglangX, and you can consider me not a tutor. I want to give you an overview of what tenor is all about, and I want to start off by going through the etymology of the word tenor. It comes from the Latin language, and it comes from the word tenere, which means that which is held, maintained, and sustained. Basically, it means to hold, right? So at its very root, that word comes from the idea of maintaining something, of this idea of continuity, right? And this was appropriated, or this was evolved in its meaning multiple times throughout history. So in Middle English, for example, so that's in the medieval times, 14th century, it was sort of used to mean um, a meaning that was consistently held across a text or speech. So it's almost like a theme or a purpose of the text, right? So it's the general purpose of the text, or it's the flow of the text, or it's the meaning which is held throughout the text, right? In music as well, we have this wonderful guy singing opera. I'm sure if you had the audio of this guy singing, it would sound absolutely wonderful, but it's the picture. In music, it holds a very, very similar meaning, right? It's the holding part. So it's the voice that's sustaining the melody while the other voices vary. So you can imagine this guy, if he was singing, he would be maintaining a certain pitch, like ah, and he would hold it, whilst everyone else around him is playing a different melody, right? So he is sustaining, or he's holding his melody. Okay, so it's again the idea of continuity, the idea of support. In the 15th and 17th century, tenor also became known as the tenor of daily life, the character, the tone, habitual course of something, right? It's the general way in which something in life carried on. And then we have this guy here, wonderful M.A.K. Halliday, I think that's how you pronounce it. And he appropriated that term. He used that word tenor and applied it to linguistics. So he took that meaning, which was appropriated throughout centuries, to mean the continuity of something, and he applied it to linguistics. So I'm going to put him up to the right-hand side. Oh no, he's still staring at us, but that's fine. He took it to mean the overall tone, the overall character of an interaction, right? So it's the social relationships and the roles which are held or sustained between participants in an interaction. So are they equal? Are they unequal? Are they friendly with each other? Things like that, right? And so for English language purposes, tenor basically means the tone of the relationship between participants. Okay? All that to say, tenor basically means the relationship that you have with other people. So tenor basically means relationships. Now, there's different elements to tenor. When we consider relationships, there's different dynamics, there's different things that characterize what a relationship is, right? What makes tenor tenor? And there's three things that I'm going to be teaching you today. First of which is power, second of which is solidarity, and the third of which is social distance. And these three is what we're going to be talking about in great detail over the course of this video. And I also have a very good acronym for you to remember these three things. It's called PISS. You can thank me later. And I know there's no I, but that's fine. Firstly, let's start off with solidarity. Let's look at the dictionary definition of solidarity. So it means unity of agreement of feeling or action. That word of unity is important, especially among individuals with common interest. Okay? And read the next part, mutual support within a group. Think about it. Okay, so an example sentence, factory workers voiced solidarity with the striking students. Okay? So a good example of this is in a protest, right? You have all these people coming together, they're all advocating for something, abortion, whatever, right? They're protesting something, right? And this person here, he says, we stand in solidarity with each other. What does that mean? He stands in unity with each other. They're standing together. They're all working towards a common goal, right? It's expressing mutual support within that group. So it's the sense of unity, the sense of a common goal, right? That's what creates solidarity, right? So going back to the slide here, linguistically, what solidarity means is the level of mutual support, the level of rapport, the level of emotional closeness and oneness, or the sense of unity that interlocutors have with each other. Just for the record, interlocutor means speakers, basically. So participants in a discourse are called interlocutors. So when we consider solidarity, there can be two forms of solidarity. You can have high solidarity, which, using the definition before, is a high level of mutual support, or you can have low solidarity, which is a low level of mutual support. Okay? So let's look at high solidarity first. High solidarity is when the interlocutors share strong personal bonds, they have a common goal, or they have a common group identity, right? They might be part of the same in-group, for example. From, for area of study 2, you would know that there are different social identities, things like age, right? Teenagers have their own group. Gender and sex, the LGBTQI community have their own group. Occupation, depending on what job you have, doctor, lawyer, engineer, you're going to have your own group. Interests, right? If you have a particular hobby that you're interested in, they have their own group. And they all use language which characterize them, right? Which help them feel like they are together, like they're one, like they stand with each other, right? So if you're into a particular hobby, right, you're going to use jargonistic terms which have prestige or which are respected within that community, which helps build the sense of solidarity, the sense of oneness, right? And so how might this manifest into language features? You might have a lot of shared in-jokes, right? And these are references that only make sense within the group. So you can talk about inferences, right? Perhaps in a speech or between a conversation, they might have a lot of inferences which only the participants would be able to understand, or perhaps a lot of deictic references, which once again, only people in the conversation will be able to understand because they have this shared experiences. They have strong personal bonds. They are, in a sense, one with each other because they are able to relate to each other. They may be part of the same group, part of the same interest group, for example. So shared in-jokes, inferences, deictics, that's definitely one really interesting one. Ellipsis. Ellipsis is basically, technically speaking, when you leave out a part of a word or you leave out a word in a sentence because context fills the gap. For example, instead of being elaborate and saying, "Are you coming to the event?" to your friend, you might just say, "Coming." Are you coming? Or not even, "Are you coming?" Just "coming," right? Just that one word, because context fills the gap. Your friend who has all these shared experiences with you, who might be part of the same interest group, would be able to understand through context what you're talking about. So you might see a lot of ellipsis. We also have overlapping speech. So you might see speakers talking over each other without offense because that mutual understanding with each other is high. So, between two friends, perhaps, if you wanted to manifest or if you wanted to see an example of how high solidarity would happen, one guy might say, "Oh, you legend, how's life?" Another person might say, "Mate, you wouldn't believe what happened. Remember that guy from Macca's? Yeah, him." Right? And so they use nicknames like legend. They use colloquial greetings like I gave you the example, the oi at the start of the word, the mate, which is an endearing vocative there. It's an endearing nickname that they're giving them, right? And it's understood perfectly because both participants share enough background knowledge with each other, right? They said, "Remember that guy from Macca's," right? If you said that to a rando who didn't have shared experiences with you, they would not get it. Because your friend has this sense of unity with you, right? He's able to infer what you mean by that guy from Macca's. Now, low solidarity, on the other hand, is when the interlocutors or speakers have little shared history or emotional connection, right? Perhaps they're not part of the same in-group. So you can have this manifest with politeness markers. So you might use a lot of pleases, a lot of excuse me's, a lot of thank yous. You might have a lot of titles and honorifics when you're addressing the other person. So Dr. Patel, sir, madam. You might have a lot of elaborate language, right? Elaborate language to ensure that the message is explicit and you don't cause misunderstandings with the other person, right? So you often notice when you have a low solidarity with the other person, instead of shortening, you actually tend to lengthen out your sentence. So in terms of an example, right, say it's you have two people meeting in a completely formal environment, don't know each other, randos to each other. So in a formal networking event, say, you might introduce yourself by saying something like, "Hey, My name is DeMarcus Jackson. Or not even hey, maybe like good morning, which is more formal. My name is DeMarcus Jackson. I'm a data analyst at Deloitte. It's a pleasure to meet you. Notice how it's more elaborate, right? And so it's following those social norms with no slang, with no in-group references, and that is because they have low solidarity with each other. So returning to this diagram here, right? High solidarity allows you to bend rules because the relationship itself acts as the safety net, right? Misunderstandings are misunderstandings can happen, but they can be resolved easily and they won't damage the bond because you relate to each other, because you understand each other. You know, if someone accidentally insults you, you probably know the other person didn't really mean it. Whereas if you have low solidarity with each other, you need a lot of linguistic caution because if you say something wrong, it might actually cause offense to the other person, or it could be misinterpreted by the other person because there's perhaps less trust or there's less shared context to fall back on. Okay? And that's why, the same person in different contexts, they speak wildly differently depending on who they're speaking to. For example, they're talking to a sibling who they have high solidarity with. They might say something like, yo, grab us a snack. Or if you're talking to a lecturer, you might use more elaborate language. So, excuse me, professor, would it be possible to discuss the assignment later on? Something like that, right? So solidarity is a very important idea. Let's have a look at social distance. Once again, have a look at the technical definitions. Social, referring to human relationships, and distance, the length of the space between 2 points. And obviously here, it's not used in the literal sense, it's used in the metaphorical sense. Okay, so linguistically, you can think of social distance as being literally, socially, how distant are you? Are you close to each other? Are you far to each other? Okay, so linguistically, it's how well do the interlocutors know each other personally. Cool. So you can think about it in, again, the metaphorical sense, so distance. If you have a low distance with each other, you're close to each other like this, right? And so you have close social distance, so you interact with each other frequently, you see each other a lot, so low social distance. Whereas if you don't see each other frequently, you're distant, you're far away from each other, okay? So you have high social distance, so low social distance, high social distance. So it's inverse to solidarity, so keep that in mind. So high solidarity means you're close with a person, and low social distance means you're close to the person. So it's the opposite. So don't confuse them. Literally think about, I think this diagram helps. I visually think about it literally being close social distance or high social distance. Cool. Oh, this little beaver staring at me. What does he want? He's staring up. Oh, he wants to show us this. Cool. Social distance. There is a distinction from social distance and solidarity, right? Social distance is about how frequently you interact with each other, how familiar you are with the other person, right? Whereas solidarity is the emotional closeness, shared identity that you have with the other person. They're actually distinct concepts. I'll give you an example. A person can have low social distance, but low solidarity. Think about it. Low social distance, low solidarity. Can you think of an example of that? So low social distance, which means they frequently see each other. Perhaps they're in the same class. Perhaps they say, oh, hi, hello, every day in class. But you have low solidarity. They're not emotionally close with each other. Perhaps they even dislike each other, even if they interact every day. They're not part of the same in-groups, right? And because of all that, they would have low solidarity, even though they have low social distance. Okay? So don't conflate those two. Even though they overlap, don't conflate them. So let's first look at low social distance. So low social distance means that the participants, again, interact with each other and know each other's personal circumstances fairly well. And once again, this is purely based on the frequency or the familiarity you have with the other person, not necessarily how much emotional connection you have with the other person. So I want you to quickly brainstorm, pause the video, quickly brainstorm 2 or 3 different relationships in which you might inherently have a low social distance. And if you're playing it right now, things like classmates, right? Some of your classmates are obviously going to be good friends, but the other ones you might just be acquaintances with, but you still interact with them even if you're not emotionally close with them, right? So you have low social distance with them. Work colleagues, right? Very likely that with work colleagues, because you see each other 9 to 5 every single day, you're going to have low social distance. Perhaps you have high solidarity, perhaps you have low solidarity, but you're probably going to have low social distance. Neighbors, right? You're probably going to see your neighbors, next door neighbors quite often as well. Doesn't mean you have a lot of emotional connection, but you still see and interact with them quite frequently. And family as well. You would also have low social distance as well. So in terms of language features you can expect from a low social distance is things like nicknames, right? Using first names instead of the full form Mr. blah, blah, blah. Things like direct imperatives, right? So instead of softening it and saying, could you please, if you don't mind, could you please pass me the pen? You might just go straight for it and say, pass me the pen, right? So direct imperatives. So they don't take offense to these direct imperatives. That's an important idea. And once again, inferences to shared experiences. If you see each other every day and like inevitably you're going to be going through the same circumstances, most likely. And so you would be able to understand those inferences to those things that you have both seen. So similar to solidarity, once again, they do overlap. Don't think of them as being mutually exclusive from each other. Features are going to overlap. In fact, you could link one example to all three of solidarity, social distance, power, right? But from a principal perspective, it's important that you know this, right? So that you elaborate on tenor properly and you actually understand what tenor is all about. So, for example, between two neighbors, right? If you're asking for a favor, instead of being really elaborate and saying, hey, good morning, please, thank you, you would be brief, you would be direct, you'd be casual because of the familiarity that you have with the other person. For example, you might very simply say, hey, watch my dog for a sec. I got to grab the mail. Full stop. It's very direct. And they're not going to take offense at each other because of that low social distance, because of the frequency of interactions that they have with each other. Now, conversely, high social distance. Interlocutors do not interact frequently or personally, right? So even if they're part of the same general community, they have little shared background knowledge about each other, right? And so in terms of language features, you might have more formal introductions. You might have more complete, explicit explanations to avoid ambiguity. You might have politeness markers. You might have hedgings. And I put that there, the complete elaborate explanations to avoid ambiguity. You might use a lot of surnames, a lot of titles like Mr., Doctor, pleases, thank yous, which are politeness markers, things like that. So an example of high social distance, for example, if you don't know a tradie and you're calling them for the first time, you're probably going to introduce yourself something like this. Hello, is this Mr. Edwards? My name's Marcus. I live on Oak Street. I'm calling to get a quote for some plumbing work, right? Notice how it's clear identification of who's talking with the formal opening, context provided, because there's no prior relationship between both participants. Now, why does social distance matter? When social distance is low, language can be compressed because context doesn't need to be explained. When it's high, on the other hand, language has to be expanded so the listener has enough information to actually understand what's going on, right? And so if you're sending an email, if you're writing a message to an old friend that you have, you might notice that you are quite less elaborate, you're more short, but it's still full of references. Whereas your first message to a potential employer, say, is going to be very long. It's going to be very carefully explained. It's going to be very elaborate. Cool. So that's social distance. Number 3, power. Technical definition. There we go. It is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events, right? So linguistically, that power or the ability to influence manifests with a relative social, institutional, or situational authority that one interlocutor or speaker has over another. So for example, a high power person to a lower power person, think about what sort of relationship that might be. I'll give you a second. So things like doctor to patient, perhaps, or teacher to student, principal to student, boss to employee, right? So they're all higher power people speaking to lower power people. And so this higher power interlocutor has the power to control the conversation, right? They're probably going to use more imperatives, right? So, instead of, again, being elaborate, they're just going to say, submit the report by Friday, full stop. They're not going to explain themselves. They're going to use very high modal verbs like must, you must do this. You might use minimal politeness markers, right? Again, get to the point. You're not going to be elaborate. You need short, direct interrogatives like, why wasn't this done? And you might also notice that they have control of the topic, right? The person in the higher power typically is the one that's going to be controlling the topic and actually decides what the other person can talk about. So you might notice there's more topic shifts, and a key indicator of that is discourse particles. So for example, a teacher to their student might say something like, hand in your homework at the start of class. right? And if they say hand in your homework, that's an instruction. It's not a suggestion, right? And it's because the teacher has that institutional authority or that power over the student that would permit the use of the imperative, hand in your homework there. Cool. And then we have low power to high power, so vice versa. So the lower power interlocutor is going to have less control of the conversation. They're going to probably show more respect. So for example, they're going to use more hedging, politeness markers, titles, honorifics, things like that. And longer explanations as well to sort of justify why they're doing something. So let's have a look at an example, right? So if you're trying to ask for an extension from your professor, you're going to be much more elaborate. You might say something like, Professor, I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if it might be possible to get a 2-day extension on the essay, if that's okay with you. I don't know, right? So you're using a lot of hedging there, even using an apology, saying sorry, using a formal address, Professor. And that's all to show deference. It's to show respect to the power or the authority that the teacher has over you. Okay, now I want to quickly touch on this idea of situational power. Situational power. So far, we've touched on institutional authority, right? So inherently, a teacher has more power than a student, inherently. But, right, between equals, typically power is going to be shared. So you're probably going to expect equal time on the floor, for example. You're going to expect, they address each other as equals. They're not going to use titles between each other, etc. But not all interactions have power imbalance, but there's this idea of situational authority, right? So for example, I want to give this example. Say there's two friends, generally speaking, inherently or institutionally, they don't have power over each other. They're considered equals, right? But say one is a qualified lifeguard and the other one is in trouble, right? He's drowning in the sea and the friend is a lifeguard, right? The lifeguard might temporarily take the place of the person in higher power, right? So he's not going to bother being elaborate or stuff like that. He's just going to command him and say, grab the float, kick towards me, right? He's going to use all these imperatives and not really care for using titles to respect the other person, or like he's just going to get to the point, right? So temporarily, he might assume the higher power role. So that's situational power. So yes, typically they would be equals, but situationally, people can be more powerful than the other person. That's situational power. The last thing I wanted to touch on before we finish up is this idea of tone versus tenor. This is something that trips up a lot of people. What the hell is the difference between both of them? You can think about tone as being the flavor of certain writing. You read something, it has a particular air to it, right? It is a polite tone, it has a sarcastic tone, an aggressive tone, a warm tone, right? So you read a writing, it's the air of the writing. Whereas there's a distinction. Tenor is the role relationships, okay? The air of the relationship itself, not the air of the writing, but the air of the relationship, okay? So tenor is inherent to someone. Tenor is inherent to a relationship, okay? It can be reflected by language choices, right? But just reading the language choices and saying, oh, there's a conversational tone doesn't mean there's necessarily a tenor between them, if that makes sense, right? So they are slightly distinct from each other. You could argue, or you could say that, because there are overlaps with each other, you could say the tone is almost like a surface realization of the tenor, right? So for example, if the tenor is equal, if the tenor is friendly, if there's a low social distance between them, then the tone might come across as conversational. So technically it would be correct to say a conversational tenor, because the conversational tenor speaks to an equal power between them. Likewise, you could say deferential, respectful tenor, right? And that speaks to an unequal power, or it's a high social distance between them, right? And because of that, saying deferential tenor is fine. But there is a problem with saying something like humorous tenor, because now you're reading into just the tone of the writing itself, as opposed to using the language to talk about how it reflects a particular relationship between them. Because now you're just saying, oh, it's humorous. Like it has a humorous tone or a sarcastic tone, which doesn't have anything to do with SSP, social distance, solidarity, and power. So it should be PSS. Yeah, so there are overlaps between them. I would say 90% of the time, tenor equals tone, but there are exceptions. For example, humorous tenor would be wrong, sarcastic tenor would be wrong. So that was tenor. So we've gone through power, solidarity, social distance, and that is the relationships between us. And that's me, EnglangX. Evan signing off. Thank you so much for watching.